Well, hi there. So, welcome to the last lecture in microeconomics. In this video, we're going to talk about inequality, and specifically, we're going to talk about the causes of income inequality, some of the impacts, and then how do we measure income inequality in economics. So, let's get started. Okay, so the first section just is about inequality and its causes. And here is the definition of inequality. When we're talking about inequality, we almost always are talking about income inequality. Why do different laborers earn different incomes? And it turns out to be a somewhat complicated answer, right? As you might imagine, like why do some people get paid a lot and some people get paid very little? And the primary reason, though, is kind of what we call marginal productivity theory. Marginal productivity theory. And that's the biggie, right? That explains the vast majority of it. But there are some other factors that I'm going to outline in just a second. So the biggie, the primary reason why people earn different amounts is this economic kind of concept called marginal productivity theory. And what it says is that all the factors of production, whether it be workers or machines or land, are paid based on the value of their MRP, and that their MRP is the marginal product times the output price. So if this sounds familiar, that's because it comes from 5.1. And by the way, this should say 5.3. As you can see, I've kind of switched up the order here. But in short, if you have a worker with more productivity, that is to say, more marginal product, or who produce more valuable products, more output price, right? In either event, that's going to cause the worker to be more valuable and earn higher wages. So it's really fundamentally about productivity and about the price of the underlying good. And so if people really, really want to buy what you're producing, if what you're producing is very, very valuable, right? It's got a lot of value in the market, then you will have lots of value in that market. And by extension, we could also say that even if the thing that you're producing is not so valuable, but you are really good at producing it, you have a lot of productivity, right? Then we would say that you also will get paid commensurate with that because you have a lot of value in the marketplace. So it really comes down to just those two underlying factors that contribute to MRP. Right. So really, this is just saying marginal productivity theory is just saying that you're paid based on your MRP, the equilibrium of your MRPs with the factor cost that is dictated by supply and demand. Now, the other factors that we could talk about, some of them actually just reinforce marginal productivity. So, for example, obviously, there's differences in human capital. When we say human capital, that's the quality of the workers. And so some workers are better, quote unquote, at making stuff than others. You might say that maybe they have more innate ability and they have maybe more networks that give them more information about how they could produce. Or maybe they inherited a lot of money and that allowed them to have higher education, which then made them more productive. All of those things, right, innate ability, or maybe the networks, or maybe the inheritance, or just the fact that you went to a really good school, all of those things just reinforce marginal productivity theory because they affect your productivity. And so we'd say that a lot of this, differences in human capital, the differences in innate ability, you might say, right? Well, the reason that the person who has more innate ability is paid more is because they're producing something that's more valuable, right? It's because they're more productive. Just the fact that they are more able to produce doesn't necessarily make them actually more valuable. It's the fact that they do produce more that makes them more valuable. Differences in bargaining power is an outside kind of factor, outside of marginal productivity. This really just says that if the firms or the laborers, either group, if they are able to collude and work together in some way, they can either push wages up in the case of the workers, or they can push wages down in the case of firms. And you do see cases where, like in oligopolistic markets, where you have only a handful of companies, they will work together to push down wages, right? They'll kind of look around and go, okay, we should hold wages low. And if I hold wages low and they hold wages low and they hold wages low, then we're all better off, right? So even they don't have to actually overtly collude, they could tacitly collude, like with price leadership, but it's more like holding wages down. That's true in, for example, labor unions. Labor unions do the same thing. They kind of are collusive agreements. The workers are agreeing to collude, is a way to think about that, and push up wages. And so those can deviate the wage from what marginal productivity theory would dictate, right? So in a market with lots and lots of labor unions, you would expect there to be higher wages. If you have really concentrated amounts of firms, then you would expect there to be lower wages. Discrimination is also a factor in why do different people get paid different amounts, but it's actually economically irrational. So we would say that kind of the economics of it would actually push firms to be less discriminatory. Despite that, discrimination is still extant. But the reason why I want to kind of briefly touch on why it's economically irrational. Imagine you have a company that discriminates, right? And then another company that doesn't discriminate. The company that discriminates says, I'm not going to hire, for example, women, right? I don't want to hire women because I have discriminatory views about them. And so that company A is going to say, never mind, to very qualified women. Company B is going to say, I'm going to hire qualified women, right, who are good for the job, and I want them for the job. But the benefit for company B is that because company A did not hire those women, there's less demand for women in that market. And so the women are going to be earning lower wages. Company B gets to basically hire a cheaper worker and still get all of the productivity by paying them kind of that lower equilibrium wage, because company A isn't deciding that they want to hire them. And so it actually really advantages the company that decides it doesn't want to discriminate, because they get basically a discount on their qualified worker. And company A, on the other hand, right, the one that discriminated, they have to pay full price for their male workers. And so it's going to kind of tend toward company A making the economic choice to say, well, actually, I would rather hire a qualified woman, right? So discrimination is something that exists. We know it does, but it's not really economically rational for companies to do it. The last part that I'll say that kind of explains why different people earn different amounts is differences in tax structures. And this is really only true for post-tax, right? It doesn't matter before the tax hits you, but it's only after the tax. And in countries with really progressive income tax systems, right? Progressive meaning as your income rises, you pay a larger share in taxes. We typically find that those countries are more redistributive in the sense that they take from the wealthy and they give to the low income. And so they end up kind of compressing how much inequality there is in that society. Wealth inequality, differences in how much assets different households have. We would say that it's primarily caused by income inequality. So it's really come down to brass tacks. The reason why some people have a lot of wealth and some people have very little really fundamentally comes down to, are they able to add to their wealth by using greater income? Just kind of to touch on the impact of inequality and poverty, because this class is kind of agnostic about the country that we're looking at. We're not going to study, like, here's the poverty threshold, for example, for the United States. But it is useful to know what poverty means and kind of connecting it to inequality in general. Poverty refers to having a household income that is below a certain threshold. And that certain threshold is the necessity for basic standard of living. Now, that's kind of a squishy definition, right? It can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. But in the United States, it's a pretty low amount of money. If you're under the poverty line, is what we kind of say. It really means that you don't have enough income to sustain things that are necessary for living in that society. And so we do say that living in poverty is kind of a bad thing, right? Poverty is a bad thing. And inequality and poverty are concentrated among certain groups. So inequality in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It just really reflects kind of differences in productivity and the value of outputs. But poverty is a bad thing. And I kind of want to separate these two, at least in this context, this one moment here, to say that it's perfectly okay to make the argument that we should have a certain amount of inequality, that a certain amount of inequality is considered to be acceptable. But there's actually no real good economic reason to say that poverty should exist. That's not true. There's no good reason economically that we should just say, well, yeah, some people in a capitalist society should be living under a threshold where they can't sustain life. Like that doesn't follow from an economic standpoint, right? Inequality does, but not necessarily poverty. And what I'll say, that both of these, right, heavy degrees of inequality and poverty are concentrated among certain groups. When I say inequality is concentrated among certain groups, I'm saying that these groups are particularly unequal in the distribution compared to the broader distribution in the society. It typically tracks with single income families, right? If you have a family and it's one income earner, then you're going to have less income. Workers of color, right, because of discrimination, but also because of legacy access to things that give them human capital. So it may be true that a person of color who grew up in an underfunded school district and their schools weren't very good, they didn't get very much human capital, and so they go out into the labor market and they're not very productive. And then the labor market says, oh, we don't want to pay you very much. Well, an economist would look at that and say, well, that's because they weren't very productive. That's marginal productivity theory. But someone else could easily take a look at that and say, well, the reason why that young person of color didn't get a good education, why they are not productive, is because of discrimination and the legacy of discrimination in the United States. And so you could see how, even if we kind of have these top line things like inheritances or ability or social capital, access to things like social capital and human capital are often dictated by things that are not necessarily equally distributed among ethnic and gender groups in the United States. There's a few other groups here. Women, like half of the people, right? Poverty is more likely to occur with women, again, for reasons that I described earlier in terms of discrimination. Younger and elderly workers, obviously, workers with lower educational attainment. Again, here's productivity, right? If you have less educational attainment, that affects your productivity, and that would affect the wages that you earn. Higher inequality and poverty generally correlate with stuff that we don't consider to be good. And so that's the impact, right? These groups are kind of unfairly, in a sense of fairness or justice, these groups are unfairly bearing the burden of that poverty. And so that would be things like higher infant mortality, more babies of color die in the United States than children who are white. And that is fundamentally wrong, right? The fact that we have these unequal outcomes that are really driven through economics, I think is wrong. And it is important that you kind of recognize that piece outside of the notion of like the forces of supply and demand or why these things are happening. Lower life expectancy, lower life satisfaction, lower economic mobility. In other words, it's less likely that you're going to go from the poorest quintile to the highest quintile if you're born into one of these groups. And here's a quote from John Rawls, who is a great philosopher of justice. And he says, when we think about what kind of world we want to live in, when we think about what kind is a just and good world, we should think about those principles and design a world that we want to live in behind a veil, right? A veil, something that covers your face, a veil of ignorance. We should design a country that has policies and regulations where we say we're going to make it the best for all of these groups. And I don't know whether I'm going to be born into one of these groups or not, right? You're watching this video, you're probably born into a group that doesn't fall into this category. But what if you were born into that group, right? Imagine that veil of ignorance. You don't know, right? When you come out of the womb, are you going to be born a baby of color in Mississippi, or are you going to be born a white child growing up to an upper middle class family or a well-to-do family in suburban St. Louis? Again, you should make those judgments about what is a just society without knowing or kind of assuming that you don't know where you're going to end up in that society. Now, the last thing I want to share with you about inequality is actually how we measure it. And there are two ways. One's called the Gini coefficient, one's called the Lorenz curve. There's not a whole lot you have to know about them. A Gini coefficient is a numerical value. It goes between 0 and 1. And 0 means that there's no inequality at all in the society. And 1 means that there's total inequality in the society, that one person or one household has all the wealth and all the income. So it goes from 0 to 1. And again, it's really just a numerical calculation. It's based on this curve down here called the Lorenz curve. And the Lorenz curve is a visual representation of that inequality. And each of these two, country X and country Z, are Lorenz curves. So you have kind of actually two Lorenz curves on here. And you also have what's called the line of equality. Now, the line of equality is not necessarily an attainable goal. It's not even a goal. It's just telling you, like, if this society were equal, then you would have 40% of the income would be earned by 40% of the households. And likewise, at 60% of the income, you would have 60% of the households. So it would be an equal distribution. If the curve bends more towards this corner, right, bend here, unequal will bend here. So out of the two of these, right, which country has more inequality? Well, this is country X and this is country Z. So we would say Z. It's simply just X and Z. Z is more unequal. Assuming the curves are post-tax incomes, which country has a more progressive income tax structure? Well, that would be country X because they have less inequality. So that's the type of question you're likely to be asked, right? Assess kind of your understanding of, do you understand what this graph is telling you? And then a Gini coefficient, I have not seen very many questions about it at all. Again, it's really just a number between 0 and 1. And it's actually a ratio of the areas of these Lorenz curves. We don't necessarily get into that. Hopefully this helped you understand the causes of inequality, what inequality is, its impacts, and also how we measure it. I'll see you next time.